My name is Elena Marrow. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in spaces where you're expected to be polished, agreeable, and quietly grateful for being included. On paper, I've always looked for a steady, reliable job, consistent results, no public scandals, no dramatic exits. The kind of person people describe as capable in a way that somehow still means forgettable. If you ask the people around me back then how they saw me, they might have said I was intense as a child, difficult to place, someone who asked too many questions, and didn't quite fit the rhythm everyone else seemed to learn naturally. Later, they softened that language. I became independent, self-contained, a little sensitive. Words that sound harmless until you realize they're often used to explain why someone is overlooked, talked over, or quietly kept at a distance. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about proving anyone wrong in a loud, cinematic way. There are no villains here in the traditional sense, and no triumphant speeches delivered under bright lights. What happened unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, across years, through silences, assumptions, and moments that didn't seem important at the time. It culminated on a day that was supposed to be purely celebratory, a graduation celebration, a room filled with people who believed they already understood who I was and who I would always be. On that day, an old label resurfaced, one I thought I'd outgrown. Problem child, not said with cruelty, exactly, said casually, as if it were a harmless joke, as if it were settled history. What changed everything wasn't my reaction. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even feel particularly angry in that moment. What changed the entire direction of my life was that someone else spoke first. Someone who had been watching me quietly for years. Someone whose influence came not from authority or volume, but from clarity. This is a story about emotional justice, but not the kind that arrives with applause. It's about what happens when you stop trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you. It's about the power of being truly seen, sometimes by only one person, and how that can reorder an entire room without raising your voice. I'm telling this now with honesty, not dramatization. I don't need you to take sides. I don't need you to imagine yourself winning. I only want to walk you through the emotional terrain as it actually felt. The quiet diminishment, the slow internal shift, and the moment when influence revealed itself in an unexpected way. As you listen, I invite you to reflect gently. Have you ever realized that someone had decided who you were long before you had the chance to show them otherwise? To them, I was always a type before I was a person, not in a dramatic way. No one ever pointed at me and said it out loud. It was subtler than that, expressed through tone, timing, and what was never asked of me. I was the one people relied on when something needed to be done correctly, but quietly. The one trusted with responsibility, but rarely with authority. The one whose presence was acknowledged only when something was missing. In school, teachers described me as bright but challenging. I learned early that this didn't mean disruptive. It meant I noticed inconsistencies. I asked why rules existed instead of memorizing them. I hesitated before agreeing. That hesitation followed me for years, reshaped into softer adult language. She's intense. She's particular. She doesn't need much supervision. What they didn't say, but seemed to assume, was that I didn't need recognition either. By the time I entered my professional life, I had learned how to be palatable. I spoke when spoken to. I refined my questions so they sounded supportive rather than probing. I learned how to nod in meetings where decisions were made without me, and then stay late to execute those decisions flawlessly. People praised my work ethic. They trusted me. They just didn't imagine me leading anything that required visibility. And I accepted that for a long time, not because I believed I was incapable, but because challenging the role felt unnecessary. I told myself that impact didn't require acknowledgement, that substance mattered more than perception, that if I kept my head down, the right people would eventually notice. But perception has weight, and when it's shaped early, it hardens quietly. In social settings, I was the composed one, the listener, the person people confided in but rarely celebrated. At gatherings, conversations flowed around me, not toward me. If I went quiet, no one worried. That was expected. If I spoke up, there was often a brief pause, just long enough to recalibrate, before the conversation resumed as if I'd contributed a footnote rather than a thought. I wasn't excluded. That's what made it confusing. I was included just enough to remain useful, just enough to feel ungrateful if I asked for more. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't hurt sharply. It settles instead. You start editing yourself preemptively. You stop volunteering insights that might complicate things. You let others take credit for ideas you refined because correcting the record feels socially disruptive. Over time, people stop seeing your restraint as a choice. They see it as your limit. By the time I was in my early 30s, the narrative around me was fully formed, reliable, quiet, capable, a little rigid, someone who had always been like that, as if personality were destiny rather than adaptation. What struck me later was how confidently people told my story for me. They spoke about my past as if they'd lived inside it. They referenced my childhood with a kind of amused certainty, like the conclusion had already been drawn, and all new information was simply supporting evidence. She was always a bit of a problem child, someone once said, laughing years before the graduation celebration. Not unkindly, nostalgically, as if that label explained everything that followed. I didn't correct them then either, because part of me still believed that being misunderstood was the price of being thoughtful. That clarity would come with time, that consistency would eventually outweigh caricature. What I didn't yet understand was this. When people benefit from a simplified version of you, they rarely feel motivated to update it. And so I remained who I was to them. Not invisible, exactly, but comfortably underestimated. Someone whose depth was optional to acknowledge. Someone whose silence was mistaken for acceptance rather than discernment. At that stage of my life, I wasn't planning a reckoning. I wasn't waiting for vindication. I was simply living inside a role that had been assigned early and reinforced often, unaware that someone else was watching closely enough to see the difference between who I appeared to be and who I actually was. The first small cut didn't announce itself as an injury. That's how these things usually begin, not with a moment you can point to later and say, that's when it all went wrong, but with something so minor, it feels unreasonable to hold on to. I remember exactly where I was when it happened. A long conference table, polished to the point of reflection. Afternoon light slanting in through tall windows. Coffee is going cold in my right hand. It was a planning meeting. Routine. I had prepared meticulously, as I always did, not because anyone demanded it, but because I believed preparation was a form of respect. For the work, for the people involved, for myself. At one point, a question came up about a recurring problem we'd been facing. I had noticed the pattern weeks earlier. I'd documented it quietly, traced its cause, and tested a small adjustment that reduced the issue almost entirely. So I spoke, not loudly, not forcefully. I framed it carefully, offering it as an observation, not a correction. I explained what I'd seen and suggested a simple change. There was a pause. Then someone else, someone more senior, someone more comfortable occupying space, rephrased what I just said, nearly word for word. The group leaned in, heads nodded, notes were taken. That's a great insight, someone said, but they weren't looking at me. At the moment, I told myself it didn't matter. The solution was what counted. The work moved forward. I reminded myself that I wasn't there for credit. I was there to contribute. But something subtle shifted inside me. It wasn't anger. It was recognition. I noticed how easily my voice had been absorbed, repackaged, and reattributed without malice. No one was stealing anything, not intentionally. They simply hadn't registered me as the source worth naming. After the meeting, no one mentioned it. No apology, no acknowledgement. And why would they? From their perspective, nothing unusual had occurred. But I remembered it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clean, precise, a clear data point. It was the first time I allowed myself to consider that my invisibility wasn't accidental, that it might be structural, that the way people perceived me shaped what they were able or willing to hear. Over the following weeks, I became more attentive, not reactive, just observant. I noticed how often my contributions landed differently, depending on who echoed them, and how my emails received responses only after someone else forwarded them. How decisions I quietly supported were later attributed to group consensus, while decisions I questioned were remembered as resistance. Each instance, on its own, was small, easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern. What hurt wasn't the loss of recognition. It was the unspoken assumption beneath it that I would not object. And I didn't. Not because I lacked self-respect, but because I was still negotiating my understanding of the environment. I wanted to be sure I wasn't misreading things. I gave everyone the benefit of the doubt, including myself. Maybe I hadn't spoken clearly enough. Maybe my tone had been too tentative. Maybe this was just how collaborative spaces worked. That's the danger of the first small cut. It teaches you to question your own perception before questioning the system that caused it. So I adjusted. I clarified my language. I documented more thoroughly. I followed up in writing. I became even more precise, more careful, more considerate. And for a while, that felt like progress. But the dynamic didn't change. If anything, my increased diligence made it easier for others to step into the clarity I had already created. My work became a foundation others stood on, often without realizing whose labor supported them. Still, I stayed quiet, because at that point the cut was shallow, manageable, easy to rationalize. I didn't yet see it for what it was, the beginning of a lesson about how respect is distributed, not by effort alone, but by the roles people unconsciously assign to you. And once that assignment is made, it takes more than excellence to undo it. There is a moment, quiet, unremarkable, when something that once felt wrong starts to feel normal, not acceptable, just familiar. That's the moment I crossed without noticing. After the first few instances, I told myself I was being oversensitive. I reminded myself that collaboration is messy, that intent matters more than outcome, that not every slight deserves interpretation. I leaned on logic the way some people lean on faith. So when it happened again and again, I adjusted my expectations instead of my boundaries. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. I started measuring success by whether the work improved, not whether I was visible in the improvement. I told myself this was maturity, professionalism, emotional intelligence. What I didn't realize was how efficiently this mindset trained others. When you don't object, people assume consent. When you absorb inconvenience without comment, it becomes part of your job description. My willingness to stay calm, to smooth over tension, to carry extra weight without complaint, slowly became the baseline against which I was measured. I became the person who could handle it. If a project was behind, it landed on my desk. If a conversation needed diplomacy, I was asked to step in. If someone else missed a detail, I was expected to catch it quietly. And I did, consistently. The irony is that competence without visibility often reads as compliance. In meetings, interruptions became normal, not aggressive, just frequent. My sentences were finished for me. My objections are reframed as concerns. My certainty softened into hesitation. I noticed how people spoke about me when they thought they were being kind. Elena's so solid, she doesn't need reassurance. She's not the type to care about titles. She's better behind the scenes. Each comment sounded like praise. Each one subtly narrowed the space I was allowed to occupy. And because I didn't protest, the narrative hardened. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being constantly reasonable, from understanding everyone else's pressures while your own remain unacknowledged. I carried that exhaustion quietly, telling myself it was temporary, that it would pay off in trust. But trust, I learned, is not the same as respect. Trust gives people permission to lean on you. Respect makes them consider the cost. Somewhere in this period, I realized I had begun editing not just my speech, but my ambition. I stopped imagining what I might lead. I stopped voicing long-term ideas. I focused instead on execution, on refinement, on making sure nothing failed on my watch. It felt safer that way. If you don't reach beyond what's expected, you can't be accused of wanting too much. The most unsettling part was how invisible the shift felt from the outside. To anyone watching, I was thriving. I was valued. I was included in important conversations. I was trusted. What they couldn't see was how small my internal world had become. I wasn't being openly disrespected. I was being quietly managed. And because it was subtle, because it came wrapped in politeness and good intentions, I continued to normalize it. I told myself that this was simply the cost of being thoughtful in a loud world, that not everyone needed to be front-facing. That influence could be exercised indirectly. And that was true, partially. What I hadn't yet confronted was the difference between choosing discretion and having it chosen for you. There were moments, small, fleeting, when something inside me resisted. When I felt the urge to correct a misattribution, to claim space more firmly, to remind people, gently but clearly, of my role. Each time I hesitated, not because I lacked the words, but because I sensed the risk, the unspoken rule that someone like me, quiet, competent, uncomplaining, should not disrupt the flow. So I stayed within the lines that had been drawn around me, convincing myself they were self-imposed. It's remarkable how adaptable we become when we believe adaptation is the same as growth. By the time I noticed how normalized the dynamic had become, it no longer felt like something being done to me. It felt like something I was participating in, and that realization that I was helping sustain a version of myself that others found convenient was more unsettling than any single act of dismissal, because it meant the problem wasn't just external. It meant change, if it came, would have to start somewhere far quieter than confrontation. I didn't realize it was a role at first. Roles feel intentional, like something someone sits down and decides. This wasn't like that. It emerged gradually, shaped by repetition and reinforced by my own consistency. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation that clarified everything. I wasn't meant to hear it. Two colleagues stood just outside my office, voices lowered but not enough. They were discussing how to structure a new initiative. Who should be visible? Who should manage logistics? Who should keep things running? Elena will handle the details, one of them said easily. She always does. There was no malice in it, no hesitation, just certainty. In that moment, something clicked into place. I wasn't overlooked because people doubted my ability. I was overlooked because my ability had already been allocated. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed complexity so others could appear decisive, the one who translated vague direction into functional systems, the one who ensured nothing collapsed, even if no one noticed the architecture holding it up. And because I did it well, the role solidified. Once a role becomes reliable, people build around it. They stop imagining alternatives. My presence allowed others to take risks, to speak boldly, to step forward, because they trusted that I would catch whatever fell. The problem with being indispensable in silence is that indispensability rarely leads to elevation. It leads to containment. I began to see how carefully the expectations were calibrated. I was invited into rooms where work happened, but not where narratives were shaped. I was consulted for execution, not vision. When I offered perspective beyond my lane, it was acknowledged politely, then redirected. You're so good at the operational side, someone told me once, smiling as if that explained everything. I realized then that the role wasn't just about what I did. It was about who I was allowed to be. Competent, but not authoritative. Insightful, but not influential. Trusted, but not centered. And the most unsettling part was how reasonable it all sounded when framed the right way. This wasn't exclusion, it was specialization. This wasn't dismissal, it was efficiency. This wasn't a ceiling, it was a fit. I had been assigned a role that made everyone else's lives easier, including my own, in some ways. There was safety in being needed, predictability in being relied upon. I knew exactly what was expected of me, and I met those expectations consistently. What I didn't yet know was how much of myself I was withholding to maintain that stability. There were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when I sensed the cost, when I felt a quiet resentment surface, not toward others, but toward myself, for agreeing over and over again to be smaller than I was capable of being. But resentment didn't motivate me. It only made me more careful. I told myself that roles can change, that timing matters. Patience is a form of strategy. And maybe that was true. What I didn't understand yet was that roles don't dissolve on their own. They require disruption. Not loud disruption, but undeniable redefinition. At that stage, I wasn't ready for that. I was still negotiating internally, still weighing the comfort of predictability against the discomfort of stepping into ambiguity. So I stayed. I played the role as assigned. I executed flawlessly. I made myself useful in ways that were hard to replace. And all the while, something else was happening beneath the surface. Something no one else seemed to notice. I was learning. I was observing how decisions were made, how credit flowed, how influence operated behind the scenes. I was noticing who spoke and who was listened to, who was trusted instinctively, and who had to prove themselves repeatedly. I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't plotting a reveal. I was simply paying attention, because once you see the role you've been assigned clearly, you can no longer pretend you chose it. And that awareness, quiet as it was, marked the beginning of a shift that would eventually make the role unsustainable, not through rebellion, but through irrelevance. The day something shifted did not look like a turning point. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where I finally said the thing I'd been holding back for years. If you had watched it from the outside, you would have seen nothing more than an ordinary afternoon. That's what made it so decisive. It was late in the day, the kind of hour when offices grow quiet and people start packing up in stages. I had stayed behind to finish a report again. The building had that hollow stillness that settles in when the urgency has passed, but the work hasn't. I remember staring at my screen, rereading the same paragraph without absorbing it. Not because I was tired, exactly, but because something inside me had gone strangely still. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't asking myself how to make this better for everyone else. Instead, a different question surfaced, uninvited and persistent. What would happen if I stopped compensating? It wasn't a rebellious thought. It didn't come with anger or bitterness. It felt almost clinical, curious, as if I were examining a system I'd been part of for too long without questioning its design. I thought about all the moments I'd smoothed over confusion, filled in gaps, and prevented mistakes before anyone else even noticed them forming. I thought about how often I'd stepped in quietly so someone else wouldn't have to look unprepared. And then I imagined, not dramatically, just realistically, what would happen if I didn't? The answer wasn't catastrophic. The world wouldn't collapse. Projects might wobble. Conversations might stall. People might feel discomfort that they'd grown accustomed to me absorbing. And that realization was unsettling in a way I hadn't expected because it meant my silence wasn't neutral. It was active. By choosing to remain quietly competent, I was sustaining an ecosystem that depended on my invisibility, not maliciously, habitually. That afternoon, I finished the report. I saved it. I sent it. But something in the way I worked had already changed. I didn't stay late to refine it further. I didn't add the extra context I knew would make someone else's job easier. I did exactly what was required. No more, no less. And when I shut down my computer and stood up, I felt lighter, not triumphant, but clear. Over the following days, that clarity deepened. I began to notice how often my impulse to help preceded any actual request, how reflexive my accommodation had become. I saw how quickly I filled silence, how instinctively I softened language, how readily I took responsibility for outcomes that weren't mine to manage. So I experimented, not outwardly. Internally, I let pauses exist. I answered questions directly, without cushioning. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been articulated. I remained polite, professional, calm, but I no longer volunteered to disappear. The response was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. People hesitated more in meetings. Follow-up questions increased. Small inefficiencies surfaced. Nothing dramatic. Just enough friction to reveal how much invisible labor had been happening. No one accused me of anything. No one confronted me. If anything, they seemed slightly confused. And that confusion confirmed what I'd begun to understand. My value had been most appreciated when it was least visible. That day marked the end of something internal. Not my commitment to quality, not my respect for others, but my willingness to equate silence with virtue. I wasn't planning a declaration. I wasn't preparing a defense. I was simply recalibrating my relationship to my own effort. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that restraint could be a choice rather than an obligation. That contribution didn't have to mean compensation. And in that quiet shift, so small it barely registered, I began to reclaim something I hadn't realized I'd surrendered: authorship over how I participated. No one noticed the change that day, but I did. And that was enough to begin. Once silence stopped being reflexive, it took on a different weight. Before, my quietness had been automatic, an instinct shaped by years of adaptation. I stayed silent to keep things moving, to avoid friction, to remain agreeable. But now, each moment of restraint was deliberate, chosen, and that changed everything. I began to notice how uncomfortable silence made other people, how quickly they rushed to fill it, how often clarity emerged not from my intervention, but from someone else being forced to sit with uncertainty for a few seconds longer than they preferred. In meetings, when a question was posed, and eyes drifted toward me, as they often did. I didn't immediately respond. I waited. Sometimes someone else answered. Sometimes the question hung there, unanswered, until it became clear who actually owned it. No one accused me of withholding. They simply adjusted, at least at first. Silence, when chosen, has a way of revealing dynamics that speech conceals. It shows that those who assume responsibility will be taken from them. It exposes who is used to being supported without asking. I remained engaged. I took notes. I made eye contact. I was present in every visible way, just no longer preemptive. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the room began to recalibrate around me. Some people leaned in, curious. Others grew impatient. A few seemed unsettled, as if something familiar had shifted, but they couldn't name what it was. The most telling reactions came from those who had benefited most from my previous silence. They began to mistake my restraint for withdrawal. "Everything okay?" one colleague asked casually, as if concern were a social obligation rather than genuine curiosity. "Of course," I replied evenly. And it was true. Another remarked that I seemed less involved lately. I asked what they meant. They hesitated, then laughed it off. What they meant, but couldn't quite articulate, was that I was no longer compensating. I didn't correct their assumptions. I didn't explain my internal shift. There was no need. Explanation would have framed it as defensiveness, as a reaction rather than a recalibration. Instead, I let my work speak in narrower, more intentional ways. I contributed when my perspective was explicitly sought. I executed what was assigned. I stopped translating ambiguity into action unless it was part of my role. The result was not immediate respect. It was uncertainty. People are comfortable with patterns, even inequitable ones. When a pattern breaks, the first response is rarely appreciation. It's disorientation. And in that disorientation, I saw something important. My earlier silence had been interpreted as agreement, as alignment, as an endorsement. My new silence, measured, intentional, was harder to categorize. It didn't signal dissent, but it didn't offer reassurance either. It simply existed. There's a quiet authority in that kind of presence, not because it dominates, but because it refuses to over-explain. I began to understand that influence isn't always about being heard. Sometimes it's about being unmissable in your absence. Still, I wasn't making a statement. I wasn't angling for leverage. I was testing boundaries, my own more than anyone else's. Could I remain calm without being consumed? Could I stay generous without being self-erasing? Each day, I answered those questions through small, almost invisible choices. And each day, the consequences became slightly more pronounced. Decisions slowed, responsibilities shifted, people double-checked their work more often. They prepared more thoroughly before meetings where I was present. Not because I demanded it, because the safety net had changed. What struck me most was how little resistance I encountered. No pushback, no confrontation, just adaptation. It was then that I understood something fundamental. My power had never been taken from me. It had been borrowed repeatedly, with my permission. By choosing when to be silent and when to speak, I was no longer playing the role that had been assigned. I was redefining the terms of my participation, and while no one else named it yet, the dynamic in the room was already shifting, quietly. While everyone else was adjusting to the new quiet, Something else was unfolding in parallel, something far less visible. They assumed my silence meant disengagement, that I was pulling back emotionally, that I had reached a plateau and settled into maintenance mode. It was a comforting assumption. It required no response. What they never noticed was how active I was beneath the surface. I had always observed patterns. That wasn't new. What changed was how intentionally I used that skill. Instead of smoothing over problems, I began documenting them, not emotionally, methodically. I noted timelines, decision paths, bottlenecks, and dependencies. I paid attention to who initiated ideas and who finalized them, who received credit, and who absorbed risk. I didn't frame this as preparation for anything. I simply followed my curiosity, the same one that had been labeled challenging when I was younger. The difference now was that I trusted it. I started keeping more detailed notes in my leather-bound notebook, not about tasks, but about systems, where authority actually lived versus where it appeared to live. How informal influence outweighed formal titles, which voices shifted outcomes even when they spoke last. I noticed how often decisions were made before meetings officially began, how certain people arrived already aligned, while others believed they were participating in a genuine discussion. I also noticed how often my previous work had quietly enabled those alignments. The reports I wrote, the data I clarified, the inconsistencies I resolved before they became visible. All of it created an illusion of smooth leadership above me. Once I stopped maintaining that illusion, the cracks became easier to see. I began learning, not from books or courses, but from proximity. I listened more than I spoke. I watched how questions were deflected, how responsibility was framed, how accountability was redistributed when outcomes fell short. Most importantly, I noticed how rarely anyone questioned the structure itself. People responded to symptoms, not causes. They adjusted tone, not process. They focused on optics, not substance. And I understood then why my earlier attempts to contribute more strategically had gone nowhere. I wasn't failing to be heard. I was speaking to the wrong level of the system, so I repositioned myself, not outwardly but mentally. I stopped thinking of my role as fixed. I began to see it as informational, a vantage point. From that vantage point, I could see things others couldn't or wouldn't because they were too invested in maintaining their narrative. I learned which projects generated real leverage and which were symbolic, which metrics mattered when resources were allocated, which stakeholders were listened to only performatively, and which ones quietly shaped outcomes. None of this required confrontation. It required patience. I also noticed something else. Who noticed me? Not in the obvious ways, not with praise or attention, but with calibration. A few people began to prepare differently when I was in the room. They came with clearer arguments. They asked more precise questions. They followed up more thoughtfully. One person in particular stood out, not because they engaged with me frequently, but because when they did, it was with intention. They didn't interrupt. They didn't reframe my comments. They asked for my assessment and waited for the answer. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too focused on understanding the system as a whole. What I didn't realize was that while most people had grown accustomed to my silence as a resource, a small number had begun to see it as a signal. a signal of discernment. As weeks turned into months, my internal map grew more detailed. I could predict outcomes before they happened. I could anticipate which proposals would stall and which would advance, regardless of their merit. I saw how often decisions were driven not by logic, but by comfort, by familiarity, by the desire to avoid discomfort or disruption. And I understood something that shifted my sense of agency entirely. I didn't need to change myself to gain influence. I needed to change where and how I applied my attention. Everything I was learning remained invisible. I didn't share my insights. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't attempt to steer outcomes indirectly. I simply watched. Because once you truly understand a system, you no longer need to fight it. You can step out of its gravity altogether. At this stage, I still wasn't planning anything irreversible. I wasn't preparing for an exit or a confrontation. I was accumulating clarity. And clarity, I would learn, is the most destabilizing thing you can possess quietly. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no document uncovered, no secret meeting, no moment where everything suddenly made sense in a single flash of insight. It arrived the way most truths do, gradually, and then all at once. I had been reviewing my notes one evening, not for any particular reason, just out of habit. Pages filled with observations, timelines, names, arrows connecting decisions to outcomes. What struck me wasn't any single detail, but the consistency across them. The same patterns repeated, regardless of project or people involved. Certain voices shaped direction early, others refined their execution later. Credit flowed upward, risk flowed sideways, and accountability, true accountability, rarely traveled far. I had always sensed this, but seeing it mapped so clearly changed something. It removed ambiguity. For the first time, I could articulate, privately, precisely, why my role had felt both essential and limiting. I wasn't positioned to influence outcomes because influence in that environment wasn't about insight or competence. It was about narrative ownership, and I had never been invited into that layer. Not because I lacked ability, but because I had been too useful where I was. That realization was clarifying in a way that felt almost peaceful. It meant there was nothing wrong with me. I hadn't failed to assert myself strongly enough. I hadn't misjudged the culture. I hadn't been too quiet or too accommodating by nature. I had been optimized. The system had learned exactly how to use me. And I had allowed it because I hadn't known there was an alternative that didn't require becoming someone else. Once I saw that clearly, something else became apparent. My leverage didn't lie in confrontation. It lay in choice. Choice about where I applied my effort. Choice about which systems I supported. Choice about whether I continued to lend my clarity to structures that depended on my invisibility. This wasn't about exposing anyone. There was nothing to expose. The system functioned as designed. The reveal was internal. I no longer needed to be part of it. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because I had a plan, but because the internal friction was gone. I wasn't trying to reconcile my values with an environment that quietly contradicted them. I wasn't waiting to be recognized by people who didn't need to see me to benefit from my work. I understood my position fully, and with that understanding came freedom. Over the following weeks, I began exploring possibilities, quietly, without signaling dissatisfaction. I researched roles that valued systems thinking without burying it. I had conversations off the record with people outside my immediate environment. I asked questions not about advancement, but about alignment. What surprised me was how differently those conversations went. When I spoke about my work without minimizing it, people listened. When I described patterns I'd observed, they leaned in. When I outlined my approach, they asked follow-up questions, not to redirect, but to understand. There was no fanfare, just resonance. It confirmed what I had begun to suspect. My environment had shaped my self-presentation more than my actual capacity. And I realized something else, something quieter, but more profound. I wasn't angry. There was no desire to correct the record, no urge to confront anyone about past misperceptions. I didn't need acknowledgement from people who had never been curious in the first place. What I wanted was integrity, to place my effort where it was neither diluted nor exploited, to be in spaces where silence wasn't mistaken for acquiescence. And thoughtfulness wasn't treated as a resource to be extracted. The private reveal wasn't about discovering a flaw in others. It was about discovering a boundary in myself, a line beyond which I would no longer trade clarity for comfort. Once that line existed, everything else became a matter of logistics. And logistics, unlike identity, can be managed calmly. The decision point didn't arrive with urgency. No deadline, no external pressure. In fact, that's what made it unmistakable. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to discomfort. I was choosing between futures. I could stay. There was a version of that path that looked reasonable on the surface. I would continue to be valued for my reliability. I would remain indispensable in quiet ways. Over time, perhaps a title would shift. Perhaps my contributions would be acknowledged more explicitly. Perhaps the role would expand just enough to feel like progress. I had seen that version play out for others. It was survivable, even respectable. But when I imagined myself 5 years down that road, the image felt strangely hollow. Not unhappy, just contained. As if I had learned how to live comfortably inside a shape that wasn't quite mine. The other option was less defined. It involved stepping away from a system I understood deeply, but no longer wished to sustain. It meant relinquishing the safety of being known, even if that knowing had been incomplete. It meant becoming unassigned. What made the decision difficult wasn't fear of failure. It was the absence of drama. There was no crisis to justify leaving. No injustice severe enough to point to and say, "This is why." From the outside, my life looked stable. Leaving would require explaining something I didn't want to argue about. And yet, internally, the decision had already begun to settle. I noticed how differently I moved through my days once I allowed myself to consider departure as legitimate. Meetings felt less consuming, setbacks felt less personal. I was no longer negotiating my worth in real time. Instead, I was observing with detachment. That detachment clarified something important. Staying would require me to continue lending my energy to a structure that depended on my silence. Leaving would remove that energy altogether. Neither option involved confrontation, but only one was irreversible. I spent several evenings walking alone, letting the question surface without forcing an answer. I didn't make lists of pros and cons. I listened instead to what felt congruent, and what I felt consistently was relief at the thought of choosing myself without needing permission. The final decision wasn't announced, even to me, in dramatic terms. It was a quiet internal commitment. I will not negotiate my clarity away again. That was it. Once that decision was made, everything else aligned naturally. Not easily, but cleanly. I updated my materials. I reached out to contacts who had shown genuine interest in my thinking, not just my output. I explored opportunities that valued discernment over compliance. I didn't rush. I didn't hide. I simply moved forward without over-explaining. What surprised me was how little resistance I encountered. Because I wasn't pushing against anything, I was stepping out. There's a particular calm that comes with irreversible decisions, not because they're easy, but because they end internal debate. Once you choose a direction that aligns with your values, uncertainty becomes logistical rather than existential. By the time I formally committed to the next step, the emotional work had already been done. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. And in that settledness, I understood something I hadn't before. Power doesn't always announce itself when it arrives. Sometimes it shows up as the absence of hesitation. Once the decision was made, I moved carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the process. There was no dramatic shift in my behavior, no sudden disengagement, no signals that anything had changed. If anything, I became more composed. I handled my responsibilities exactly as before, met deadlines, communicated clearly, fulfilled expectations. From the outside, I was steady, unchanged. Internally, everything was in motion. I began the practical work quietly. Conversations were discreet, exploratory, not performative. I asked precise questions about scope, authority, and values. I listened more than I spoke. I paid attention to how potential collaborators described success, whether they spoke in abstractions or specifics, whether they asked about outcomes or optics. Each interaction gave me information. I didn't share my frustrations. I didn't recount past slights. I focused instead on what I was building toward, not what I was leaving behind. That restraint was intentional. Narratives once released have momentum. I didn't want to create a story I would have to manage later, so I let my actions remain quietly aligned while my intentions stayed private. At work, small shifts began to register, not as conflict, but as absence. I stopped volunteering for initiatives that didn't align with my strengths. I declined a few requests that would have required me to compensate for unclear leadership. I asked for clarification where I would once have improvised. Each refusal was polite, reasoned, unemotional, and each one subtly altered the rhythm people had come to rely on. No one challenged me directly. They adjusted around me, the way people do when a familiar pattern no longer functions automatically. I was careful not to frame my boundaries as statements. They were simply facts. I don't have the capacity for that right now. That falls outside my current scope. I'd need more clarity before committing. None of it was confrontational, but it was definitive. In parallel, I secured what I needed to move forward. A role that values systems thinking. A structure that recognized quiet authority rather than exploiting it. Terms that were clear, mutual, and sustainable. When the offer came, I didn't feel excitement so much as confirmation. This was the environment my clarity belonged in. I gave notice respectfully. I expressed gratitude honestly. I didn't explain beyond what was necessary. That was perhaps the most unsettling part for others. Not the departure itself, but the lack of narrative around it. People are accustomed to reasons, to emotional cues, to provide justifications that reassure them they are not being left behind. I offered none of that, not out of coldness, but out of integrity. I didn't want to reduce a considered decision to a palatable story. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle changes. Meetings took longer. Questions circled without landing. Responsibilities were redistributed in ways that revealed how much I had been holding together. Still, no one named it. Silence has a way of delaying recognition, and I was already elsewhere, mentally, structurally, before anyone fully registered my absence. Moving in silence wasn't about secrecy. It was about allowing the consequences of alignment to unfold without interference. I left without disruption, and that, I would learn, was more disruptive than any exit speech could have been. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They rarely do. At first, they appeared as mild inconveniences, things easy to dismiss, easier to rationalize. A deadline slipped. A meeting ran long without resolution. A report came back with questions that hadn't been asked before. Nothing alarming. Nothing anyone could point to and say, "This is the problem." But I wasn't there anymore to absorb the friction. From a distance, emotional, not geographical, I could sense the shift. Not because people told me about it, but because patterns have a way of revealing themselves once you know how they work. The first thing to go was efficiency. Tasks that had once moved smoothly now required clarification. People who were used to arriving unprepared found themselves exposed. Conversations that had relied on me to translate intent into action stalled. Still, no one connected it to my absence. It was framed instead as a temporary disruption. Transition challenges, growing pains. That's how systems protect their self-image. The second consequence was subtler. Confidence wavered, not overtly. No one admitted uncertainty, but it showed in hesitation, in over-documentation, in the way decisions were deferred upward more often than before. Without someone quietly ensuring coherence, leadership had to confront complexity directly. And complexity, when unmediated, makes people uncomfortable. I heard later, from someone who had no reason to dramatize, that meetings felt heavier. There was more discussion, but less alignment. More voices, but fewer conclusions. What they were experiencing was not my absence. It was the absence of the buffer I had provided. The third consequence was relational. People began reaching out, not with apology, not with reflection, but with curiosity. Questions framed as casual check-ins. How are you settling in? Do you miss the team? What made you decide to leave in the end? I answered kindly, briefly. Without reopening doors I had closed intentionally. I didn't correct their assumptions. Some believed I had left for an opportunity. Others thought I had been underutilized and grown restless. A few seemed to sense there was more, but didn't know how to ask. What struck me was how none of them asked what I had been carrying, not because they didn't care, but because they had never seen it. The system hadn't taught them to. As weeks passed, the consequences compounded. Work that had relied on institutional memory faltered. Nuances were missed. Mistakes surfaced later, when they were more costly to address. None of this caused the collapse. That's important. Systems like the one I left are resilient. They absorb loss, they adapt, they move forward. But adaptation has a cost. And the cost was now being distributed differently. People who had once benefited from my quiet labor were now encountering its absence directly, not as punishment, but as exposure. There was no moment of realization where someone said, "We misunderstood her." Instead, there was a gradual recognition that something essential had been missing all along. Not a person, a way of thinking. And because that way of thinking had never been fully acknowledged, it couldn't be easily replaced. From where I stood, the most telling consequence was internal. I felt no urge to intervene, no desire to help from afar, no temptation to step back in and smooth things over one last time. That urge, the one that had driven so much of my earlier behavior, was gone. In its place was something quieter: trust. Trust that I had left for the right reasons. Trust that my absence was not a failure of loyalty, but a completion of responsibility. I had given what I could for as long as it was sustainable. The consequences unfolding were not a reckoning. They were rebalancing. And for the first time, the weight I had carried silently was being redistributed without my involvement. By the time people began to sense that something fundamental had shifted, the window for correction had already closed. Not because I was unreachable, not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the conditions that made my return possible no longer existed. At first, the tone of communication changed. Messages became warmer, less transactional, a little more personal. "Just wanted to check in. We've been thinking about you. Hope the new role is treating you well." There was nothing manipulative in it, no urgency, just a subtle recalibration, like people adjusting their posture once they realize they've been leaning too heavily in one direction. Then came the invitations, not explicit offers to return, nothing that direct, but exploratory conversations, requests for advice, invitations to share insight on initiatives that were suddenly struggling to find coherence. I listened politely. I answered selectively. I offered perspective without ownership. What they were really asking, though no one said it out loud, was whether the stability I had provided could be reintroduced without changing the structure that had depended on it. And the answer quietly was no, because what they were missing wasn't my presence. It was the conditions under which my presence had been possible. In order to fix what had unraveled, they would have needed to acknowledge how much had been delegated without consent. How often my restraint had been mistaken for availability. How my silence had been used to maintain a sense of ease elsewhere. That kind of acknowledgement requires more than appreciation. It requires structural humility. And that was the one thing the system didn't know how to offer. Instead, there were gestures, compliments about my work, now spoken in hindsight, casual remarks about how no one quite does it like you. Suggestions that perhaps, if circumstances were different, we might collaborate again. All of it was sincere, and all of it arrived too late. Not because I had hardened, but because I had moved into alignment. In my new environment, silence was not interpreted as compliance. It was understood as consideration. My questions weren't softened, they were welcomed. My refusal to compensate for ambiguity was seen not as withdrawal, but as professionalism. For the first time, I wasn't buffering anyone from their own responsibility, and I wasn't being asked to. That contrast made a return impossible. What surprised me most was the absence of satisfaction. There was no sense of vindication watching others struggle, no pleasure in knowing my absence was felt. If anything, I felt a quiet sadness for all of us. For how long have we mistaken smoothness for health? For how much unspoken labor had been normalized? For how easily clarity is overlooked when it arrives without ego? The system didn't collapse. It adjusted, slowly, imperfectly. But the version of me that had sustained it no longer existed. You can't ask someone to return to a role they've outgrown, not without asking them to become smaller again. And that, I knew, was not something I was willing to do. So when the final message arrived, carefully worded, open-ended, framed as a conversation rather than a request, I declined gently, not with an explanation, not with justification, just honesty. This chapter is complete for me, and it was. The confrontation, when it finally happened, did not feel like a confrontation at all. It took place in a quiet cafe, the kind chosen deliberately for neutrality. No institutional walls, no hierarchy implied by seating, just two people across from each other, cups cooling between us. It was my former mentor who asked to meet. This mattered. They had been one of the few who never dismissed me outright. Also, one of the few who had never fully intervened. Their influence had always been subtle, present but restrained. We spoke first about neutral things, the weather, the pace of work, how time compresses when you're no longer measuring it by deadlines you didn't choose. Then they paused. I want to ask you something, they said. Not defensively, not urgently, carefully. I nodded. When did you decide to leave? The question wasn't why, it was when. That distinction told me everything. I didn't give them a timeline. I gave them the truth. When I realized I had become a solution to problems I wasn't allowed to define. They didn't interrupt. They didn't correct me. They just listened. I continued not to persuade but to clarify. I wasn't mistreated. I wasn't angry. I just understood that my silence had been mistaken for agreement for too long. There was no accusation in my voice. And because of that, there was nothing to defend against. They exhaled slowly. I think, they said after a moment, we thought you were fine. I was functional, I replied. There's a difference. That was the closest the conversation came to tension. And even then, it wasn't sharp. What followed was something rarer than an apology. Recognition. They spoke about moments they now saw differently, about how often they had relied on me to stabilize situations without considering what that cost, about how easily a label, independent, self-contained, had become justification for not checking in more deeply. I should have spoken up earlier, they said quietly. I believed them, but I also knew something had shifted beyond repair, not between us personally, but structurally. I don't regret my time there, I told them, and I don't need anything corrected. I just needed to stop being the person who made it easier not to notice. They nodded. No defensiveness, no attempt to negotiate. That's what made the moment feel complete. There was no demand for reconciliation, no promise of future change framed as an incentive, just mutual clarity. Before we parted, they said something I hadn't expected. At your graduation celebration, they said, when someone called you a problem child. Do you remember what happened next? I did. They had spoken first. They had calmly reframed my past, not as difficulty, but as discernment. They had named my questions as early integrity. They had shifted the room without humiliating anyone. I hadn't thanked them properly at the time. "I remember," I said. They smiled, not proudly, but knowingly. "Influence," they said, "sometimes comes from those who truly see you." That sentence landed differently now. Not as validation, but as closure. We left the cafe without promises, without unresolved tension, without the need to stay in each other's orbit. And that, I realized, is what a clean confrontation looks like. No heat, no spectacle, just truth, spoken once, and then released. Who I am now is quieter, but not smaller. That distinction matters. For a long time, silence was something that happened to me, a byproduct of adaptation, a way to remain acceptable in spaces that valued smoothness over depth. Now, silence is something I choose, not to disappear, but to preserve clarity. I no longer confuse being calm with being compliant. In my current work, I'm still observant, still measured, still intentional, but I am no longer invisible by default. When I speak, it's understood that I've already thought through the implications. When I pause, it's taken as reflection, not absence. What changed wasn't my personality. It was my position in relation to myself. I don't rush to fill gaps that aren't mine. I don't absorb discomfort just to keep others comfortable. I ask questions without softening them to avoid being misread. And when something doesn't align, I name it early, without drama, without apology. This doesn't make me louder. It makes it clearer. I've learned that respect isn't negotiated through endurance. It emerges through boundaries that are consistent and unremarkable. Through showing up as you are, without editing yourself to fit a role you didn't choose. The most surprising part of this shift has been how little I miss my old self. Not because she was weak, but because she was tired. Tired of translating, tired of buffering, tired of being praised for resilience when what was really being rewarded was self-erasure. I carry her with me now differently, with appreciation, not obligation. She taught me how to read rooms, how to listen for what isn't said, how to hold complexity without rushing to resolve it. Those skills didn't disappear when I stopped being invisible. They became assets. I still don't seek the spotlight. I don't need to dominate conversations or assert influence overtly. I let my presence do the work it's meant to do. No more, no less. And I've noticed something else. People respond differently when you stop performing smallness. They listen more closely. They prepare more carefully. They don't assume access to your energy without invitation, not because you demand it, because you no longer offer yourself up for misinterpretation. I am no longer interested in being understood by everyone, only by those who are willing to see without simplifying. That has narrowed my world in some ways and expanded it in others. I move through life with fewer explanations, fewer justifications, fewer internal negotiations. I don't need to rewrite my past to make my present make sense. I let the through line exist quietly. When I think back to that graduation celebration, to the label that resurfaced so casually, I don't feel anger. I feel distance, not from the people, but from the version of myself that once believed she had to outgrow other people's misunderstandings by shrinking into them. I didn't need to prove anything. I needed to reposition. And now, when I'm seen, It's not because I've made myself more visible. It's because I've made myself unavailable to roles that require me to disappear. That is who I am now. There's a certain kind of story we're taught to expect when someone is underestimated. A turning point, a public correction, a moment where the truth is revealed so clearly that no one can deny it. This wasn't that story. No one stood up to apologize in front of a crowd. No narrative was formally corrected. The label that once followed me, problem child, was never officially retracted or debated. And that's okay, because the deepest form of emotional justice doesn't require consensus. It requires alignment. What I learned through all of this is that being misunderstood is not always a problem to solve. Sometimes it's information, a signal that you're being seen through a lens that benefits someone else more than it serves you. Trying to fix that lens can consume years of energy. Energy spent explaining, softening, proving, waiting. I chose something else. I chose to step out of the frame entirely. Influence, I've come to understand, doesn't always come from those who speak the most, or lead from the front, or correct every misrepresentation. Sometimes it comes from those who see clearly enough to stop participating in systems that rely on their quiet sacrifice. Sometimes it comes from someone who speaks once, at the right moment, not to defend, but to name. That's what my mentor did that day at my graduation celebration. They didn't contradict anyone harshly. They didn't shame the room, they simply offered a truer frame, and because of who they were, the room adjusted. But what mattered more than that moment was what followed in my life afterward. I stopped asking to be understood by people who weren't curious. I stopped confusing endurance with integrity, and I stopped offering my silence as proof of agreement. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after listening to this, it's this. You don't owe your clarity to environments that require you to disappear to function. You don't need to correct every misunderstanding about who you are. You only need to choose where your effort belongs. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave quietly and let the absence of your labor speak for itself, not as punishment, as truth. Before we close, I want to ask you something, not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever realized that you were being valued for how much you could carry, rather than for who you actually are? If so, I'd love to hear what that realization changed for you.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.